Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to Equip for Equality's second live Facebook training. Today, we're really pleased to be here today to talk about a topic that I think a lot of us have questions on, and that's the question about vaccines in the workplace. More and more of us are starting to return. I'm here today presenting from my office, and I think a question across most people's minds are, can our employer require vaccines, and what does that look like in the workplace? So to start, I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Rachel Weisberg. I am a 40-year-old white woman with red hair and glasses. I am wearing a black and white dress. And as I mentioned, I'm excited to be coming to you from Equip for Equality's office on Michigan Avenue. I'm escaping the Lollapalooza crowds for now, but we got to get out of here at some point to make sure that that doesn't happen. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a supervising attorney with Equip for Equality, and I also manage Equip for Equality's Employment Rights Helpline, which Hannah and I will talk about in a bit. So Hannah, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thanks, Rachel. Hi, everyone. My name is Hannah Walsh. I am a 31-year-old white, identifies non-binary, but more femme person. I'm wearing red glasses, my hair is up, and I'm wearing a gray collared shirt. I am an attorney at Equip for Equality. Like Rachel said, I work on the Employment Rights Helpline. We work on that together, and I also manage one of our federal funding programs for that assist people who are beneficiaries of Social Security and are experiencing barriers to work. Yeah, that's me.
Okay, so let's talk about what Equip for Equality is. So for folks who may not know, Equip for Equality is the protection and advocacy agency for the state of Illinois. We are one of a national network of organizations that are essentially disability rights legal organizations. Our mission is to advance the human and civil rights of people with disabilities in Illinois, and we do that by providing a wide variety of services. We do everything from providing what we call information and referral, where we help direct folks to the right place, to providing behind the scenes self-advocacy assistance. We do a lot of policy work, all the way up to providing litigation direct representation in either individual litigation cases or in systemic cases like a class action. We have a number of different legal teams. We have a civil rights legal team, a special education team, and an abuse investigation unit. Our contact information is on the slide, and we will also be putting it in the chat for you. You can always contact us at 1-800-537-2632. Our TTY number is 800-610-2779. And our website is www.equipforequality.org. As Hannah and I both have mentioned before, we wanted to put in a plug for what we call the Employment Rights Helpline. It's where Hannah and I spend most of our time, and what we really want to make sure folks are aware of, because although we're maybe a little bit biased, we think it's a really fantastic resource, and we want to make sure folks know that it exists. So essentially, Equip for Equality has a helpline. It's for job seekers and employees with disabilities in Illinois, and we started this helpline back in 2017 with the idea that sometimes for employment situations, it's better not to have a lawyer, write a mean letter or go right to court. Sometimes really what can help in an employment situation is to kind of just get some answers, right? To talk through situations, to strategize, maybe to have a lawyer look over an email that you're going to send to your boss, or you have a question and you're not sure where to turn. I mean, really, with the Employment Rights Helpline, there's no question that's too little or too small. We are here to discuss your rights, to answer your questions. We spend a lot of time talking to folks about reasonable accommodations. We spend a lot of time helping people understand, here are your rights and here are your options, and let's talk through the pros and cons of all of your options so people can make some good informed decisions. And then we have a whole library of what we call self-advocacy resources. So things like fact sheets and sample letters and forms. And these are all things that we want to use to empower people with disabilities to be able to advocate effectively in the workplace. And of course, if we're not able to provide assistance, we also have a large group of referrals that we will share for people. So if you're looking to contact Equip for Equality's Employment Rights Helpline, the contact information is on this slide. We'll also put it in the chat. And our phone number is 1-844-RIGHTS-9. And that's the numbers are 844-744-4879. And you can also email us at employment@equipforequality.org. Okay, so with all of that information being said, let's talk a little bit about what we are and what we aren't going to be talking about today. Before we talk about what we are, we're going to start with what we're not. And I just want to make an acknowledgement that, we're talking about vaccines. This is a topic that people have very strong opinions on, and Hannah and I are not here today to talk about the goods or the bads or anything like that. We're here really to give the legal information that we best understand. And we're really going to focus on disability rights laws. And so we'll talk about what we know about, which is the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. There are legal implications about COVID-19 vaccines under different laws like the emergency use authorization or the FDA. That is not our area of expertise. We're not going to spend time on that today. If you do have questions about that, there's a link in the slide, and we will also put it in the Facebook feed. And it's the FDA's website, and that should answer your questions. Okay, but what are we going to talk about? Well, we hopefully are going to be able to answer a lot of your questions. And we're going to go through our presentation, which has a bunch of scenarios. And what we'll do is we'll look at topics such as mandatory vaccine requirements, disability-related exceptions to those requirements and reasonable accommodations, when an employer can ask about vaccines, when an employer can incentivize an employee to get a vaccine. We'll give you some resources, and then at the end, we'll have ample time for questions. If you do have a question, you can always put it in the Facebook feed, and we'll get it that way. Or if you'd rather keep your question confidential, you can email us at employment@equipforequality.org, and we should be able to get it to you that way. Final disclaimer before we really jump in, and I wanted to talk a little bit about where the information we are providing today is coming from. And I also really wanted to emphasize that, Hannah and I are both lawyers that spend our day thinking about the ADA and how it applies to the workplace, but we do not have all the answers, right? This is a new issue. This is an evolving area of the law. And so I expect that there may be situations that come up where the answer is we're not sure, but here's how we would think through it. Most of the information we're going to be sharing today is coming from the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. As folks may know, the EEOC is the federal agency that promulgates the rules and enforces all federal anti-discrimination laws, including the ADA. So far, they really have been, I think, the only federal agency that's put out some real meaty guidance about COVID-19 and vaccines in the workplace. And so there's a link on this slide to a document called What You Should Know About COVID-19 and the ADA, the Rehabilitation Act, and other EEO laws. Most of what we're going to be talking about today is really to be going through that document and kind of putting it in real terms. And so you'll see throughout today's presentation, there's references that have the letter K, dot, and then a number. That all refers to where we got this information, because we wanted to make sure you all have where we got, like where our primary source was, and to show, where we're getting this information. We know folks are really looking forward to hearing how this is all being interpreted in the courts. It's a little bit of a preview. We do have two recent court cases that have come out within the last month about the topic of COVID-19 vaccines, one about employment and one about college. Hannah will talk about those later in their presentation, but I do want to highlight that that's maybe like our exception to it's not going to focus, that we're only going to focus on disability, because those cases were not brought under the ADA. And to the best of my knowledge, there have been no cases about the COVID-19 vaccine focused on the ADA or disability issues. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Hannah for our first hypo.
Hi again, everyone. So our first hypothetical revolves around employer mandated vaccinations. So in this situation, we have Jessica, who works in a warehouse. She's been very hesitant to return to work because even though she did get vaccinated, she has type 1 diabetes, which places her at increased risk of serious complication if she contracts COVID. So in this situation, while she is vaccinated, there is still a risk associated because of her disability. And her employer sends out a memo saying all employees must be vaccinated by September 1st. So, this is good news for Jessica. She feels more comfortable going to work knowing that her colleagues are going to be vaccinated, but 2 of her colleagues are not. So first we have Peter. Peter is not vaccinated as his family has made the decision not to get vaccinated at this point. And then we have Jacob, who is not vaccinated as he has a severe allergy to one of the components of the vaccine. So 2 very different reasons, one disability related, one not. So the question we're posing is, can the warehouse employer require that Peter and Jacob get these vaccinations? And the answer, again, from the EEOC guidance is that generally yes. Employers can require all employees physically entering the workplace to be vaccinated for COVID-19 due to the health and safety risks associated with having unvaccinated employees. However, even though employers are allowed to make this general vaccine mandate, they still need to provide reasonable accommodations for employees who cannot be vaccinated due to disability or a sincerely held religious belief. So while they can have this policy, there may be exceptions in certain situations if people have either a disability or a religious belief that prevents them from getting the vaccine. Okay, so does the warehouse employer now need to make this exception for Peter or for Jacob? In Peter's situation, under the ADA and EEO laws, an employer has no legal obligation to make an exception to its mandatory vaccination policy if his request is not due to disability or religious reason. And from the information we have, that Peter did not state that this was disability or religious related. It appears to be a personal decision of his family. And in that case, the employer doesn't have to give him accommodations or allow him to not be vaccinated. Jacob, however, is a different situation because we have the Americans with Disabilities Act. So an employer may need to make an exception as a reasonable accommodation under the ADA in his case because he cannot get the vaccine due to a disability. So what should Jacob do next? He already knows he can't do this. How does he approach this with his employer? We briefly talked about reasonable accommodations. That's the situation that applies to Jacob. His employer potentially needs to consider giving him reasonable accommodations instead of having him get the vaccine. So in this situation, there are maybe a number of different possible reasonable accommodations that could work out. So for instance, continuing to wear a face mask at work, continuing to social distance from coworkers or non-employees, maybe working a modified shift where there's less people around or Jacob doesn't have to interact with customers, getting periodic tests for COVID to ensure that he's not, doesn't have the disease and is spreading it around work, and then potentially telework, so working from home, or reassignment to a different position where the risk of him spreading COVID would be less. So as Jacob does need this accommodation at work, the first step for Jacob is typically to let his employer know that he has a disability and he needs an accommodation. Employees generally initiate the request in the reasonable accommodation process. So that would include, disclosing his disability or medical need for the accommodation. It's really helpful to specifically say, I'm requesting a reasonable accommodation under the ADA. You don't have to do that. It's not legally required, but we tend to recommend that as it gives your employer kind of a better idea of what their obligations may be in this situation. It's not legally required that you put this request in writing. You can just speak to your supervisor or HR over the phone or in person, but we also recommend putting the request in writing just so that there's documentation that you did make that request, and keep a copy of that request as well. So after Jacob's done this, The employer then initiates what's called the interactive process. And that essentially is a process where the employer and the employee work together, exchange information, exchange ideas, and try to come up with a solution for accommodations that works best for both the employer and the employee. So Jacob in our situation. The employer can request medical documentation because especially in this situation, it's very unlikely that the need for this accommodation is going to be obvious. So the employer can ask that he have a doctor confirm that he does indeed have an allergy to one of the components of the vaccine. Employers don't, however, have to provide accommodations that pose an undue hardship or a direct threat. So something to consider is in this situation, we know that COVID-19 can pose a direct threat to the health and safety of people. However, there are ways that direct threat can be mitigated through the accommodations we talked about. Those are some ways. Another thing to consider is the proportion of employees in the workplace who are already vaccinated and the extent of employee contact with non-employees. So hypothetically, if maybe Jacob had no access to the public, no interactions with customers or clients, and he was in a workspace with his colleagues, and there was a way to make sure he was isolated and separated from everyone else, the risk of him spreading that would go down and potentially wouldn't cause a direct threat. And we have a link here to CDC recommendations for this kind of situation, and we will also put that link in the chat. Okay, so the next step, Jacob's made his request. His employer has asked for medical documentation. Jacob has provided it. And they're continuing to figure out what the best solution is. When it comes to reasonable accommodations, employers are supposed to give employees preferred accommodation kind of preference, but preferred accommodation like more consideration, but they don't have to provide exactly what is asked for. As long as the accommodation is effective, that's a reasonable accommodation. So if, for instance, Jacob really wanted to return to the workplace and wanted to wear a mask and social distance and stay isolated, but that's just not possible and the risk is too high, the employer could then potentially have Jacob telework instead. And that isn't Jacob's preferred accommodation, but it would be effective in terms of protecting the safety of the workplace and letting Jacob not get vaccinated. There's also, we provided some resources below that are really helpful for employers and employees to identify potential accommodations. We have a link to the Job Accommodations Network, JAN, their materials regarding COVID-19, and as well as OSHA's COVID-specific resources. And those are also going in the chat below. And it's important to remember when it comes to reasonable accommodations that this interactive process that Jacob and his employer are in, where they're trying to figure out accommodations, this is ongoing and needs can change over time, right? So if Jacob needs specific accommodations right now, it doesn't mean he's always going to need them or he's always going to need the same ones. And employers have an obligation to continue working with the employee to give appropriate and effective accommodations. It's not just kind of a one and done situation where you ask for accommodations and you can't do that anymore. This process continues throughout the course of your employment. We also have some links to the Job Accommodation Network fact sheet regarding short-term trial accommodations, as well as our own, the Equip for Equality's Helpline fact sheet about reasonable accommodations that you might find useful to look at. Okay, another question we have, can Jacob be excluded from the workplace because he cannot be vaccinated? And the answer to that question is maybe, but only if he poses a direct threat to the health or safety of himself or others. So this situation, Jacob's situation requires an individualized assessment as well as any other employee in this situation. There's not really a blanket rule we can apply to everyone because everyone's situation is different, everyone's disability is different, everyone's workplace is different. So the ADA does require an individualized assessment of employees' present ability to safely perform the essential functions of the job. So things to consider when trying to figure out, is this a direct threat? Is this employee not being vaccinated a direct threat to the health and safety of others? Things to consider are duration of the risk. Eventually maybe the entire workforce will be vaccinated except for him, and that would greatly reduce the direct threat to others. The nature, severity of potential harm, again, how likely is it that he could pass on COVID to others if he were to get it, likelihood that the harm will occur, and imminence of harm. So those are all things to consider, but other things that are considered in these individualized assessments are, reasonable medical judgments from the person's doctor. That doctor has the best sense of this individual's disability and needs, as well as the most current medical knowledge about COVID-19. And as we all know, we're constantly getting new information about COVID-19. So the medical knowledge right now is different than it was 6 months ago and could be different than it is 6 months from now. So we just have to keep up with that to know whether or not it's reasonable in this situation. So we keep talking about direct threat to the health and safety of others. And I wanted to get a little bit more into what that actually means. So like we said, we have to rely on current medical knowledge, and the employers are doing the same thing. Employers can rely on statements from the CDC and statements from the employees' healthcare providers. Those are that's the information we have right now. And that's the only real information we have for this situation, especially Jacob, because we don't have a lot of solid medical information about COVID, or we do, but it's changing. So the employer can look at that, consider the type of work environment. Does the employee work alone or with others? Does the employee work inside or outside? What's the available ventilation? Is there space available for social distancing? So these are all things. Not only are we looking at medical knowledge, but in this individual workspace, is there ability to make sure that the employees who cannot be vaccinated are safe, and other people are safe? And although direct threat may exist in a lot of these situations, and in Jacob's situation, we still have to, even if it appears that, Jacob going into the workplace unvaccinated is going to be a direct threat, the employer still has to consider reasonable accommodations after direct threat is established. Okay, so now we're going, still same hypothetical, but we're going back to Jessica. So Jessica is the employee who has diabetes and is high risk for getting COVID. She learns that other employees are not vaccinated, and she's worried about catching COVID. What can and should she do? So some individuals, including those who are immunocompromised, might still need accommodations because their condition means that the vaccine doesn't offer the same protection it does to other people. So even though they have the vaccine, depending on their disability, it may not work as well for them, and they could still get COVID-19. So in Jessica's situation, that very well may be the case, but luckily she also has the right, as a person with a disability, to request reasonable accommodations and engage in the interactive process, just like Jacob did. So with this concern and the genuine kind of medical issues that could be presented, we would likely encourage Jessica to do the same thing Jacob did, which is reach out to his employer in writing, let them know that she has a disability and may need reasonable accommodations under the ADA. And then that interactive process starts, where she starts working with her employers to figure out, are there other ways she can be safe? So maybe in her situation, even though she's vaccinated, maybe she can telework temporarily, or she can be put in, an isolated office and the other employees have to social distance, that kind of thing. We actually previously did a Facebook Live webinar about the ADA, COVID, and return to work issues. So if you have any specific questions about that, that video is on our website as well, and on our Facebook feed, so you can watch that.
Okay. Well, that was our longest hypothetical. We have a couple shorter ones now. And this next one is about employer encouragement. So we've left the world of Jessica and Jacob, and we are now with Benjamin. So Benjamin works at a coffee shop, and his employer is encouraging everybody who works there to get vaccinated. And Benjamin's just wondering if that's okay, that type of employer encouragement. And it probably doesn't come as a huge surprise given everything else that we've already shared. But the answer to whether or not that is okay is that it is okay. The EEOC tells us that employers absolutely can provide employees and their family members with information to educate them about COVID-19 and the vaccines. The EEOC also goes on to say employers are allowed to raise awareness about the benefits of vaccination, to address common questions and concerns, and to offer incentives. So sometimes employers have incentives for like wellness programs. So there are some incentives that employers can offer to encourage folks to get COVID-19 vaccines. When incentives are okay is something that's a little bit more complicated, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail towards the end. Okay, told you that was a short one. We've got another one. We've got Lily. So Lily's office told her that everyone needs to send proof of vaccination to human resources. So in other words, they're saying everyone needs to get vaccinated, and then you need to prove it that you got vaccinated. You just take a picture of your vaccine card and send it to us. And I think this is something that, you know, we're seeing a lot of employers and other organizations do. So she wonders if it's legal to ask for that sort of medical or that sort of documentation. So to think through this, we have to kind of dig into our old ADA brains and think about, well, what are the rules related to medical related information? So as a refresher to folks, the ADA places restrictions on the types of disability related questions and the types of medical exams employers can ask employees. And the rules differ, remember, based on where an employee is in the employment process. So the rules are different for current employees and for people applying for jobs. But here, when we're talking about current employees, like we have here, the rule is that employers can only ask employees for disability related information or perform medical tests if they are, here's our legal word that we've been saying throughout this a little bit, is if they are job related and consistent with business necessity. Okay, so basically we need to, that's the rule that in the legal framework we're working with. But before we even get there, kind of a primary question is, well, what types of vaccine related questions even are disability related inquiries, right? So we know we can only ask a disability related question if it's job related, but is asking for vaccine information, is that even a disability related inquiry? So to give you a sense of what disability-related inquiries typically are, they are typically things that are likely to disclose the existence of a disability. And so when I think of what a disability-related inquiry is, in addition to just asking point blank, like, do you have a disability? Do you have a medical condition? It can be things that are likely to elicit the information about a disability. So something like, have you taken a lot of sick leave at your last job? Or what medications are you on, right? Because the answer to those questions is likely to reveal whether you have a disability and potentially what disability you have. Well, according to the EEOC, having a question about, are you vaccinated, or can you provide us with proof of vaccination? Those are not disability related inquiries or disability related requests, because if you say, yes, you are, or no, you're not, that's not likely to reveal whether or not you have a disability or what your disability is. So because of that, employers are able to ask any of these questions about, are you vaccinated? Can I have proof of vaccination, without having it be considered a disability related inquiry? Okay. That being said, there's always a but when we talk about the law and the ADA. Remember that the ADA does have confidentiality requirements. So anytime we as employees provide our employers with medical information, and even though the vaccine isn't a disability related inquiry, it is still medical information. That information does need to be kept confidential, right? So it has to be considered, it is considered a medical documentation. It has to be kept confidentially. And the ADA says these things need to be stored separately and away from the employee's personnel file. So again, employers can ask for it, but it has to be kept confidential. Okay. So moving on to the issue of vaccine incentives. So we previewed that a little bit for you, but let's look at a couple situations where we have employees that work for employers that are offering incentives. So we'll start with Sally. Sally works for a small family-owned restaurant, and her employer is offering incentives, free meals from the restaurant, to encourage employees to provide documentation that they received a vaccine. So she wonders whether that is something that is okay. And the answer to that is yes. So you're seeing a theme with a lot of these. Employers, according to the EOC, are able to offer incentives to employees to voluntarily provide confirmation of a vaccine received in the community. And the reason for that, again, remember, is that there's really no rules about this, because that question is not the vaccine question is not a disability-related inquiry. But of course, remember that if that information is provided, then it has to be kept confidential, and that information is confidential and has to be kept separately under the ADA. So I want to give you a little twist on that. Okay, so now instead of Sally, we have Sarah, and Sarah works for a large restaurant chain. And what Sarah's employer is doing is that they're hosting a vaccine clinic, and they're requiring vaccines for all of their employees. Okay, so that's a little bit of a different situation, right? It's not a third-party off-site vaccine situation. It's something that's happening at the employer. And so Sarah's situation is different, and she wonders whether that is a disability-related inquiry or a medical exam. And it's a bit different, okay? So here's why. Now, remember, again, that administering the vaccine itself is not a medical exam or a medical inquiry, because it's not seeking information about an employee's health. But I want everyone here who's had a vaccine, and remember that there's some screening questions that are asked, either I think when you sign up or when you actually get the vaccine. And those screening questions are actually disability-related inquiries, right? Because there are questions about different allergies, there's questions about different medical-related conditions you might have. And so if someone is asking these pre-screening questions, then we're back into this ADA bucket of a medical inquiry. And as a result, it has to be job-related and consistent with business necessity. Or it can be voluntary. So in Sarah's situation, we gave you these facts saying that it was a mandatory thing. It wasn't voluntary. And so it has to be job-related and consistent with business necessity. So it's a little bit convoluted. So just to kind of go over it again, remember that if there's an on-site vaccine and that comes with some pre-screening questions, if they're required, then it has to be job-related and consistent with business necessity. So meaning that there has to be a really bona fide, legitimately good reason to be offering it. But as Hannah talked about at the beginning of their conversation, employers who are doing some of these mandates are able to show in a lot of situations that absent everyone being vaccinated, there might be a direct threat to the workplace. And so again, this is kind of a weird hypothetical, and it's interesting that the EOC puts it in the guidance, because I don't really know that many employers that are offering their own vaccine clinics, but important to kind of apply these ADA principles in the event that that happens and is happening to you. Okay, so we're going to do a couple true or falses. I want everyone to put on their thinking cap, and you can feel free to type the answer into the Facebook feed or just think about it. And the question is true or false. We've got Charlie, and Charlie's employer requires him to provide proof of vaccination. So Charlie brings in a copy of the vaccine card he got when he got the vaccine at CVS. So true or false. This is a medical inquiry, and his employer must show that it's job-related and consistent with business necessity. Well, everyone have their answer in their heads? Okay, so the answer to that is false, right? Because it was an off-site vaccine. And so there's no pre-screening questions being asked by the employer. It's not a medical inquiry. It does not need to be job related and consistent with business necessity. Okay, put those thinking caps back on, true or false. Lisa's employer requires her to be vaccinated by their own vaccine site. So she has to answer various pre-screening questions before getting vaccinated. True or false? This is a medical inquiry and Lisa's employer must show that it's job related and consistent with business necessity. So hopefully you all are thinking true, and that is the answer. And again, it's because she's being asked pre-screening questions by her employer. So with that, I'm going to turn this back over to Hannah to wrap us up.
Thanks, Rachel. So we want to just get a little bit more into these voluntary employer vaccination programs. Employers can offer to vaccinate their employees on a voluntary basis. So that's, Rachel, as she was saying before, one of the ways that, an employer may not have to show that this kind of thing is job related and consistent with business necessity. The end of the day, I'm sorry, is if it's voluntary. So the employer is offering these vaccines, it's created this program, but employees can pick or choose if they want to get vaccinated through the employer. So if the vaccination is voluntary, employers do not need to show that the pre-vaccination screening questions are job related and consistent with business necessity. However, the ADA does prohibit employers from disciplining or harassing employees who choose not to participate in the voluntary vaccination program. The key word here being it's voluntary. It's totally up to the employees. In that situation, it's okay. I think we briefly talked about this before, maybe not, but employers, the question is, some employers, maybe yours or maybe you've heard of some, are giving incentives for employees to get vaccinated, and employers can offer these same incentives to encourage employees to get on-site vaccines, just like they could offer the incentives for people just to get vaccinated, period. However, these incentives can't be so substantial as to be considered coerced and to be considered they're coercing their employees to share disability related information, because the employees do have to fill out that pre-screening questionnaire, which may give information about a disability. So there's kind of a limit on what employers can do to incentivize. Sorry, I didn't realize there was a third bullet. If the employer does give incentives that are considered substantial enough to be coercive, that's not considered voluntary anymore. And in that case, the job related and consistent with business necessity standard would apply. An employer would have to show that that is the case for requiring these on-site vaccinations. As Rachel mentioned at the beginning, there are, we're aware of 2 court cases so far regarding vaccine mandates that have been brought in the courts. This first one is about an employment situation. The case is called Bridges v. Houston Methodist Hospital. And again, just a disclaimer, this is not a case about disability, but it is about the vaccine mandate. So in this situation, the hospital announced a policy requiring that employees be vaccinated against COVID-19. 117 employees then sued to block the vaccine requirement. These plaintiffs brought a number of different claims, kind of asserting bodily autonomy, 14th Amendment rights, those kind of things, but none of these claims were ADA related. So none of these plaintiffs claimed that, I have a disability that makes it so I can't get the vaccine. That was not a part of this case. Even without the ADA claims, the court dismissed this case. So the court found that this hospital's policy was fine and that the hospital could mandate vaccines. The case is now currently on appeal. So we may get a different result or a more kind of expansive result at the end of that appeal. And then the other case is in the context of higher education. The case is called Clausen v. Trustees of Indiana University. In this situation, like the hospital, the university required students to be vaccinated or to apply for a medical or religious exemption, which would then, if they did have a disability related need or a religious exemption, they would have to wear masks, obtain COVID-19 tests, and social distance. Some of the students challenged this, but again, none of the claims that were pursued through the courts were under the ADA. The court denied the motion for preliminary injunction. And while ADA claims weren't brought in this case, the court did acknowledge that the university has that medical exception that they're allowing students to have. So it was kind of mentioned, but it was not any kind of component of the case itself. So hopefully this was all helpful, and hopefully we'll have more cases that provide more clarity later. But in the meantime, we have some links in this PowerPoint to some resources that might be helpful. Again, we got most of our information from the EEOC guidance. We have a link to that here, the Job Accommodations Network. There's also an ADA national network. The CDC is also an important place to get updated information. And then also, as we explained in the beginning, our Equip for Equality's Employment Rights Helpline. If you have questions that came up during this presentation that you feel like it would be better to have like a one-on-one conversation with someone, please reach out to us. You'll probably end up talking to me, and we can get kind of into the details of your situation and the questions you have. So now we have some extra time. We want to open this up to questions from anyone. Again, you can put them in the chat or email us if you'd prefer. Rachel or I will read them out loud, and then we can answer them if you do have questions.
And the final thing this is Rachel, the final thing I wanted to say is that we do love feedback and try to always update our trainings based on the feedback that we get. And so we'll put a link to a SurveyMonkey survey in the chat. We only asked a couple of questions. We'd appreciate it if you take a minute and tell us what you thought of today's discussion and what we can do better next time. So the only last pitch I wanted to make before we open it up for some questions or some dialogue, and that is, we're seeing more and more cases about COVID-19 come down in the courts. Again, there's been limited about vaccines, which is today's conversation, but we're seeing more and more about other topics, including employment and voting and corrections and higher ed and all sorts of really interesting things. On September 22nd, Barry Taylor and I will be doing a legal webinar for the Great Lakes ADA Center all about what courts have been saying with respect to COVID-19. You can sign up for that. It's a free webinar. We are also giving 1.5 hours of CLE credit for it. You can sign up for it at www.ada-legal.org. And we will have some interesting cases to talk about. So we're going to see if there's any questions that come in.
It doesn't look like we have any in the chat, and it doesn't look like we have any emails at this time either.
Okay. Then the last thing I wanted to say, and I'm not sure if we have this to be able to put in the chat, but Equip for Equality does have a project right now to help folks get vaccinated. So if there is anyone who's watching today that needs any assistance at all, has questions about the vaccine, needs any assistance with transportation or anything like that, I'm gonna try to swap what I'm sharing on my screen to show some information. And then John, if you're able to, maybe if you could, I don't know if you can attach the PDF, but that may be too technologically advanced for us. Oh, we did it. It's in the chat. So actually, that's all I think we need to do. So if you do have any questions vaccine related, there's a link to our information on our website. It's equipforequality.org/vax, VAX-help, and that should get you to the right place. So we're just going to sit tight for about 10 more seconds. Any last minute questions, please feel free to write them in. Otherwise, feel free to reach out to Hannah or I at any time. We're always happy to talk about this issue, other employment issues, other ADA issues, and we appreciate you spending your late afternoon with us, and happy Wednesday, everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.